Thanks for inviting me to come and talk about meadows. It seems of all of the things I do as a conservation biologist, this is by far the most interesting to people. So I give this talk, well, versions of this talk a lot. However, it's the most fun for me to talk to folks in the context of gardening rather than technical things or engineering or stuff like that. So I'm really excited. And speaking of which, last night I woke up to find two of my juniper bushes that have never been touched by deer skeletonized. So I'm working through that right now. Anyway, as I persevere through the pain, I just want to point out really quick that I am part of ESF's Restoration Science Center. I oversee the Conservation on Private Lands initiative with my boss and longtime associate mentor, Don Leopold, and folks like Molly Jacobson, our pollinator ecologist, really smart people that I get to hang out with. By the way, Don's book is over there, and I get a penny every time someone buys it. One of his like 9 books, something like that. And I also want to thank the Skaneateles Lake Association that's been funding this work for the last couple of years, which allows us to hire students and former students, you'll see pictures of them, that make this possible. I could not do this myself. So today I'm going to focus on the basics of designing a meadow and creating it from start to finish. And it's mostly pictures, but I'm glad to hear this is being recorded because I was going to offer to send the slides to folks who want them because I have some of the finer details written down so you have access to them. But I'm going to stop doing the introductory stuff and get to it so I have time. And I'm going to point to things and say, now you see this, and everyone on Zoom is going to be really confused. So. Exactly. Uh-oh. I could switch it to mine if you want. I've got backups for everything. I teach so much if you don't have backups. So the laser pointer works. So normally when this happens in class, I tell jokes to my students until someone shows up to fix the technology. So I like math jokes. What did the 0 say to the 8? Nice belt. Thank you. Hey, we're good. You don't have to suffer through any more of that. Sorry about all the people erasing their contact information from the sign-up sheet after the minutes. I do want to point out that if you'd like to learn more about what we do, we're kind of all over YouTube, and we've been honored to be on all the local stations that cover important regional news. I've been really honored to be interviewed by Scientific American about meadow restoration internationally. So we're out there, there's a lot of information, and we've got tons and tons of guides and other things that we've produced over the last few years completely for free on our website. I should have brought paper copies, but I completely forgot, but you can look at the digital ones. So please, there's tons of information out there, including a whole series on every step of making a meadow. We also converted part of our quad to a meadow this year, or last year, I guess. The UK did this at their King's College, the Cambridge Oxford College. And it's really funny because when I read that paper, and then I was interviewed about it as an outside expert for Scientific American, they complained about having so much trouble getting knapweeds to take on their quad. So we're doing better than them. But just an example of some of the information we've put together to help educate visitors to the college about what we're doing. And then years and years from now, we'll do so much research on all of the elements of biodiversity that use these systems, not just at our quad, but elsewhere. And I want to thank our current program coordinator, Elise. Elise graduated last May and is now working at the college and doing all of the hard work that I'm taking credit for. Elise is amazing in one of our meadows there, and so many other people that have contributed to this program over the years, students, former students, employees. This isn't just me, that's the point. But me, I've been doing this work since 2010. I was a land manager in Virginia for several years. I've been back in New York since 2017. And so this Lawn to Meadow program really started in 2020, actually before COVID time warped me. I'm not sure exactly what happened and when during that period. I think maybe it was 2019. We didn't start this. This idea has been around forever, converting lawns to meadows, and it's experiencing another resurgence in interest lately. And landowners came to ESF looking for guidance on how to do this because they were disappointed at the apparent lack of knowledge in the landscape business community on this topic. So I plug this to students, I plug this to you. This is a vacuum of small to mid-sized service providers that can do this work. There's not that many people that are expert and have the knowledge and equipment to do this. So maybe start a business and work with us. I've been doing this for a very long time. I've made meadows all over the East and consult on meadows as far west as Oregon, high desert. It's not really a meadow at that point, but whatever. So this is one thing that I'm pretty good at, and I love it. I like standing in these plant communities with these wonderful people. First, let's talk about why people are interested in this. Lawns are bad. Sorry, they're not great if you're hoping to enhance biodiversity and ecological function. And that's what I do. I'm biodiversity focused. The reason for this is that lawns tend to be low diversity in terms of species composition and very, very simple in terms of its structures. That's the three-dimensional arrangement of the parts, the blades of grass. I'm not saying lawns are full out wrong. There is something pleasurable about putting nice mow lines into a lawn. Honestly, it reminds me of those little like Buddhist sand things at Starbucks. There's something, I mean, look, it's not wrong per se, but there are other ways in which we can engage with our land's maintenance that are still fulfilling, but also much more hospitable and productive in terms of the things we get from nature and the things we want to do to support nature. So let's just look at lawns. I'm a conservation biologist. My specialty is restoring habitat to enhance biodiversity and manipulate the output of ecosystem services to support our economy. Lawns don't do that. So to me, they represent a lot of real estate that I can enhance for these purposes. Let's compare lawns to something we're familiar with. So there's just under 3 million square miles in the conterminous US. That's the lower 48. We're not including Alaska. That'll mess everything up. So compared to national parks, that's a familiar number. There's actually more specifically turf lawn alone than the national park area in this entire geographic extent. To me, I see an enormous, enormous market for enhancing habitat quality. And meadow restoration on lawns or conversion to lawns is a really good example of how you can replace one plant community with a pretty similar one, at least superficially, and get so much more value out of it. And ultimately, long-term, usually it's less expensive to manage than a lawn. Actually, it is in almost every situation, but I got to be careful about saying that because then people are like, oh, it was expensive this one time. It's about recurring costs. We'll show some examples of that. But what is a meadow and what is restoration? I have to be careful using this word restoration. Typically, when people think of this concept, they think of restoring a plant community or a patch of habitat or an ecosystem to a historic point in time that they decide is the correct one. That is absolutely important. I do that sometimes too. But we have to be careful here when we're talking about this form of restoration that we are not designing for a historic plant community. My restoration for meadows is objective driven. I want to help the elements of biodiversity that are important today and in need today, like pollinators, crop pest predators, and other beneficial insects, birds, small mammals, all of these things. And I want to do exactly what they need for now and the future. And by picking out well-designed assemblages of plants and the management regimes that go into maintaining these systems, we can, and I don't mean to be a jerk here, but we can actually do that better than nature could if we just left it alone. So I don't want you to think that we're trying to, restore a historic plant community. We're in fact using novel combinations of plants, some of which aren't even native to New York. And yet they're associated with conservation significant pollinators that we are now finding in our meadows and are not finding elsewhere in the landscape, including rare bees. So I hear a lot about no mow May. Let's get this one out of the way. I see a lot of eyes rolling. You're my people. It's a really well-meaning idea. I don't want to knock it too much, but the reason that it is not comparable to actual ecological restoration is this famous diagram. You've seen this, right? This one that I stole, this is from, if you can't see it, the Illinois Native Plant Guide. So this has been around forever. But what it shows is above and below ground biomass of plants commonly associated with meadows. And you can see that below ground, there is incredible complexity. There's a lot going on. There's a lot of material. So not only does this create a more diverse and in terms of frequency of animals, a more abundant soil biological community, but think about the amount of carbon sequestered in the tissue of these plants. It's like an upside down forest. Trees don't have roots that go down 30 feet, at least the ones around here. These herbs do. I have so many students that have that tattoo of a tree and its roots, and it looks like a mirror, and I just don't have the heart to tell them that's not how trees work. We have, this looks like a liatris. You probably can't read that. I can't. Roots going down over 15 feet. You know, if the soil can allow that, of course. We have thinner soils in some regions. But I want to draw your attention to the far left. I circled it there. Kentucky bluegrass. Not much complexity above or below ground. So our lawns, if we just don't mow them, there's still not a ton of diversity of high value plants in terms of their associations with our local animal diversity and the microbial diversity that supports ecological systems. 3 or 4 grasses and maybe a forb or 2 like white clover, and you don't mow it. Other problems include those combinations of plants create thatch. Meadow combinations typically don't, and thatch is what rodents and other elements of biodiversity we usually don't want in our yards. That is what they use to burrow through. And I worry that doing these very well-meaning but sometimes counterproductive things like no mow May could give people the wrong idea about meadow restoration holistically. So this is why I turn down all the people that want to interview me for No Mow May, because I tell them they're probably not going to want to hear what I have to say. But it is a really good, I do think it's a step in the right direction. I hope it isn't a misstep where people get the wrong idea. So what I'm going to go over again briefly, and I can hang out as long as y'all want to chat, designing a meadow, and then the other key techniques. So how the options available to clear vegetation and the potential impacts that those have on biodiversity, planting it, and then how do you maintain it in the critical first couple of years and beyond? Step 1. This is one of the slides with a lot of text on it, sorry. So I'll put it all up there. Just some things that I'm sure you all are aware of, maybe some new ones, but I think these are common sense ideas. So thinking about why do we want to do this? Usually when I talk to landowners who are interested in this, they have the same idea. They kind of just want to do right by nature. That's excellent. That's what I would call a goal. A goal is kind of a vague thing, right? But an objective is a very specific step to achieve that goal. And so I would say that my biggest issue in working with landowners, it has nothing to do with the science. It's about people expectation managements. It's about making sure people understand, why do they want to do this? How do they want it to look? What do they want it to attract? And most importantly, it's usually couples that do this, and making sure they actually are on the same page, because surprisingly, that isn't always the case. So things like vegetation height, how much difference in vegetation height or spread between plants, the density, all of these are important questions because they achieve different things. Most of the meadows that I create and work in are ones that we would design for invertebrates. They're very, very dense in terms of plant spacing. They're flower heavy, much more floristically dense in terms of the plant spacing and number of plants than you would see in most natural grasslands. The reason for that is typically I work in very small spaces of less than a few acres. And I often have people with, 1 acre saying they hope they get grasshopper sparrows nesting in the meadow we're going to create. And I have to explain that scale dependent things like reproduction of birds, it's a little complicated. So we typically design for how we get the most bang for our buck given the space available. And if we can't make a nesting home for grassland birds, we can sure make a restaurant for them so they can go and eat caterpillars and all the things they need to feed their babies. A meadow for wildlife looks pretty messy. There's bare areas, there's a lot of heterogeneity in the plant heights. An insect meadow looks a lot more like you might consider a garden. It's very pretty. It's somewhat orderly in the plant distribution. And you'll see some pictures of that. So some other things that you might not think of, and I'll go into detail on a couple of these just to get them in your minds. Things like, what are the wildlife associations? Are you trying to benefit a particular taxon like butterflies or a specific species like the monarch butterfly? Or is it simply, maybe I want to protect water quality by putting a nice vegetated buffer around this stream? There's a lot of objectives, and usually people have lots of them when they start to really think about how they want to do this work and why. Okay, so thinking about goals. Now, I've talked a lot about biodiversity, the sum total of the richness of life on this planet, and that's my job. I'm a conservation biologist. So my starting point is usually what is best for these bugs and bees and all of the unloved things in nature that underpin and support our society that need habitat to do that. And one of the most important things you can do, especially if you're managing for insects, which should be your goal on small pieces of land, because that's how you do the most good for all elements of biodiversity. One thing to think about is not just are there flowers, but are there flowers that have the shapes that all insects can access? Think of something like a Penstemon digitalis. And you can see this bumblebee, you can see her butt sticking out there. That's a relatively early blooming flower in this part of the world that's typically used in meadows. Lots of penstemons out there, like using hirsuta as well. But Penstemon digitalis tends to grow pretty well in most conditions. It's a tubular flower. Long-tongued insects, like most bumblebees, lepidopterans, tend to like them, even hummingbirds, so they're often not around in time. As Penstemon digitalis is winding down in its peak bloom, Monarda fistulosa, bee balm, or wild bergamot, is ramping up. Same thing, once fistulosa is beginning to wind down, Monarda punctata is ramping up in late summer. These are all from my garden. They're like my little backyard meadow. What we have is not just an unbroken supply of floral resources, nectar and pollen. We have the flower morphology that these insects need. It's not just long-tongued insects. This is Lanceleaf coreopsis, not native to New York. I put it in every meadow because there are rare bees associated with it, and now we're detecting them. This is a cyprid fly, looks like a bee. It's actually a hoverfly. Short-tongued, it prefers these ray-shaped flowers. So flower morphology. The meadows that I create are almost entirely by seed. I've done a tiny planting of just some plugs. It's a matter of economics. I can make you a Cadillac seed mix that costs like 65 bucks a pound. That's all you need for 3,000 square feet. Imagine if you were buying a plant for every square foot. It doesn't make sense. However, I encourage people to play with these meadows and treat them like a garden, not some wildlife habitat that's been restored and they're no longer welcome in it. This is theirs. It's an actively managed system. So I will usually use a base layer of reliable seeds that perform different functions. So, flower shape, holding soil, sequestration, water protection, all of these key things. And then once that base layer has been established, we can add highlights. It's kind of like if you've ever watched The Joy of Painting with Bob Ross, you put in the firecrackers. And I didn't mean for these all to be purple. These, again, just from my garden, plants that I've added as plugs later to add themes in key locations, like this mist flower that I put in a kind of wetter area, and it's spread just among the wetter areas. All of the other plants that were already established kept it in check because it could get a little misbehaved. Agastache funiculum, what's that one called? Hyssop. Yes, Anisyssop, that's it. I'm not trying to show off with Latin names. Plants have one Latin name. They could have 50 common names. I don't want to remember all that. And I lived in Virginia. They have different names for everything. And then we have obedient plants, very much not an obedient plant in the garden, but again, put it in a wet area and nowhere else could support this plant, so it stayed put. This is how you can play with these things and get the design that you want out of something that's more economically done at the outset by seed. So how do you create a seed mix? Oh, I love doing this. I dream in spreadsheet graphics. I'm really an interesting person. So here are just some factors that you need to think about. They're less important for what you're doing in terms of their benefits to biodiversity. I assume that if many of you are working in home gardens, or if you do this for a business, it's relatively small scale, less than a few acres per project, I assume. And density is a little less important there. We want plants to be very, very dense. In this case, density is more important about your client's wallet because you don't need to buy more seed than you actually need. So think about how far apart you want the plants. If I were doing this meadow farther south for bobwhite quail, I might need 4 pounds of pure life seed per acre. Because if you're a little baby quail, you're the size of a bumblebee and you need plants to hide behind, but also space between the plants to run around. If it's too dense, they won't nest there. If I'm doing this for insects, I might use 15 or 20 pounds of pure live seed per acre. It's harder to screw up the conditions to create a relatively sparse meadow than it is to screw up a meadow you want to be dense and full of flowers. Deer, oh, I'm having flashbacks to my bush. Other things, thinking about ecotyping. So ecotyping is where the plant was produced. So this could be a species like common milkweed. Common milkweed has a really cosmopolitan distribution. It's everywhere. And you'd think that milkweed from, I don't know, Maryland is the same as milkweed from, I don't know, the Albany area. Nope. They could be very different. And despite being a wind dispersed plant where the seeds just blow off into the wind, even populations of common milkweed just a mile apart can be genetically quite different from each other. And that difference can affect their capability to perform well on a site. And that's key. So if you work with good seed companies like any of these, Ernst, Roundstone, Prairie Moon, Pinelands, there's also Prairie Nursery, similar sounding name. If you work with them, they'll help you ecotype. They'll typically select seeds from their production areas that are closest to the conditions at your property. And this is also really important to me because there's not a lot of local seed stock that's available that's locally harvested. And that's a wonderful endeavor. It's not something that's going to happen without the work of people like you. Companies, they cannot do that at scale and make money. This is something that has to start from the ground up. So I saw some heads nodding. If you're saving local seed, please keep doing it. You're really the only ones where this material will come from. Just some basic rules of thumb. I mean, always have at least 3 species blooming in every major season. Always include at least 5 families of plants for lepidopterans. Caterpillars tend to eat food based on plant family. Famously, monarchs are quite specific. They eat milkweeds, common, swamp, butterfly. And it's very easy to achieve in a meadow. I mean, we already saw 5 plant families. There's grasses, there's sedges, there's mints, there's penstemons, there's asters. There's 5. And basic rule of thumb, don't mix a short clumping species with a tall rhizomatous species. If you put butterfly milkweed and Canada goldenrod in the same meadow, butterfly milkweed's going to be around for the length of a cup of coffee. These systems can look very different. Meadow is not really an ecological term. Something like old field, if someone tells me that they have plants in an old field in northeastern North America, I'll know what plants those could be. But a meadow is more of a casual term. We can use it to describe lots and lots of conditions. I think of a meadow as a grassland with more flowers and grasses. Here's some examples. This first one I'm showing you, I didn't do. It's the only one I didn't make. This is from Pennsylvania. I'm trying to give a geographic distribution beyond central New York. We'll get to those soon. This is in June, a classic combination of combining penstemon digitalis, that's the white flowers, with the blue, like indigo. Do you know what that one is? Whoa. Oh, Baptisia would bloom a little later. It's in the same family. Spiderwort, there it is. By the way, thank you, because you actually said things out loud, daring to be wrong, but trying anyway. If you were like my students going... Anyway, yes, this is Ohio Spiderwort, Tradescantia ohioensis, classic combination, really pretty. Just close up. Really nice. This is my backyard, but Shu took the photos. My approach to photography is I take 1,000 pictures and I hope one's good enough. Same meadow, different positions, showing different scales. And now in July, now we have a lot more color. Really pretty there. You get combinations of things that show up. So the yellow, that looks like oxeye sunflower, Heliopsis helianthoides. But do you know what the grasses are? Those tufts? It's not Timothy. At first I thought it was Timothy. I'm like, oh, that's kind of cute. It's actually Phalaris, reed canary grass, or canary reed grass. I always mix that up. It's something you do not want in a wetlands. There is apparently a native population of this. They're one of those things we call cryptogenic, where there's problematic non-native ones that behave differently and perfectly fine native ones, but you can't tell them apart unless you look at their DNA. We'll figure it out. But anyway, it's still pretty. Hey, I've even used a hard fescue not native to North America in a meadow before because there was an erosion problem and the people installing it didn't consult me about the seed mix first. So I had to do an emergency 18 pounds of, I think it was Festuca ovina variety durascula. It's like a type of sheep fescue, really nice, but it was already in the landscape. So I felt like I wasn't doing anything too wrong. Erosion control was the fire we had to put out. I'm not a purist when it comes to this stuff. I'm a let's get the job done for biodiversity stuff. Zooming in, we've got Culver's root and some nice, that's an oxeye or a coreopsis. That's too late for coreopsis. Oxeye covered in bees. It's beautiful. And then in September, nice. See how flower dominated or forb dominated this is? We've got like one big blue stem and then it's forbs. It's beautiful. This is Euthymia graminifolia, the grass leaf goldenrod. It's got that beautiful fruity smell. And then elsewhere, I mean, this to me is far more interesting than just a lawn. This is like reflecting the foliage of the autumn trees on the ground. It's so pretty. Now let's look at somewhere nearby is my backyard. I make really pretty flower meadows for people, so I became like a hipster and I wanted my own meadow to be very green and just 3 colors of flowers, and it's all about texture, not color. So this is our first meadow that we did for the landowners that approached us. And what I want to show you is how rough these systems can look the first couple of years. Like I said, expectation management. The hardest part of my job is making sure that people understand the first 2 years you're going to hate me and think it didn't work.
Yeah.
Drill that into your heads. And you know what they all say after the first year? You know, you said it was going to be so bad, and actually it wasn't so bad. I'm like, So this is just the second year in June. So it's only had one full growing season. It's just kicked up again. Not particularly interesting right now. There's some texture, but not much color. We see, of course, coreopsis, a big flush. There's a lawn daisy that was still in there. Landowner's friend was flying by in an airplane, took this picture and sent it to them. This is a black-eyed Susan flush. I use black-eyed Susans like a companion crop because they kind of phase in and help the establishment of the other plants, and they're pretty and cheap. I love doing it. But then in August, it looked like this. That's the first or second year, depending on what conditions were present the first year. This is a temporary thing. So again, expectation management. It does look like this. It's nice though. And this is a more mature meadow. So I'm just defining maturity as most of the species are at their maximum height and most of them are now flowering. This is by year 3. Meadows typically take for my definition, 5 to 7 years to reach maturity. There's my boss for scale. You know, it's funny. So that's Jess Hafner. His dad owns Hafner Nurseries. And it turns out he moved into the property where he made a meadow the other couple of years. He's like, oh, this is great. I was like, yes, it is. So engaged in it. And then the view, again, this meadow and the others around Skinny Atlas Lake, the reason we focus our work there is because this is about water quality, and we're intensively looking into that issue. And our quad, again, it's in its ugly duckling phase. So now we have to clear the vegetation. And this is the most contentious, difficult part of this. I'm a land manager. I've used every technique to manage vegetation all over the East, and that includes herbicide. It scares me that you can walk into a hardware store and just buy even glyphosate without any training. I use them, and I have licensed professionals that I hire for stuff that I no longer want to do. But here are some options. We have things like soil disturbance, disking. We have things like scouring, that's removing the top layer of soil and its vegetation. We have things like herbicide. On smaller sites, we can even use smothering. That's covering it with something. Again, scale dependent. If you have an acre, you're not going to smother it. That's an ecological disaster. So tilling, ripping apart the plants. Tilling, people tend to lean towards this as kind of an organic option. And unfortunately, it doesn't work great to successfully till up even a lawn. And all of these things depend on what is currently growing and what seeds are in the soil seed bank. But this is not a one and done process. Around here, what we found is you have to start tilling as soon as the ground is dry enough to get a machine on it. So maybe late April at the absolute earliest. And you have to do it maybe once every 6 weeks, 3 or 5 times to sufficiently tear up the roots, dry them out, and then exhaust the seed bank. That's key. Once you disturb the soil, whatever's in there is going to germinate. And then you have to kill that again, and then again, and it takes a while to exhaust that. There's problems with that. Scouring. This is a small meadow we did for a demonstration, literally ripping up the plants and soil with it. Now, one of the advantages of this technique is you can plant the meadow literally right after this. You don't have to wait for the tilling to take effect. You don't have to wait for an herbicide to take effect. Usually those practices mean the first year is spent in preparation. This you can just seed immediately. This is what you get. Now, for smaller scale, I recommend a machine like a lawn roller. This is not small scale, but it's the only picture I had. This is a meadow we did at the Wellington House earlier this year. The landowners wanted to do this chemical-free approach. We're like, great, and they were completely fine with the cost. But you can rent lawn stripping machines and do this yourself. The stripping is actually easy. It's moving all the stuff. What are you going to do with all that? They had a use for it, so it made sense for them. I'm in okay shape. I could not lift one of these. This is a tremendous amount of work. So think about before you do it. This is what the meadow looks like after 3 months, though. So. Oh, there must have been condensation on my lens. There's a lease back there, a lease in the mist. There are drawbacks to scouring. This is a site, it was 8 acres in Northern Virginia. We scoured it, put erosion control devices at the base of the hill, 10-foot deep trenches. Glad we did, because 3 days after we seeded it, a freak 2.5-inch rainstorm in less than 12 hours happened. Those 10-foot deep troughs were full. Small sites may be appropriate for some of your own projects. You can, of course, smother the site. This is simply preventing the plants from photosynthesizing. Please use porous fabric. If you prevent water from percolating in or gas exchange between soil biota and the atmosphere, you kill the site. Notice everywhere there's a hole, everywhere a deer stepped, a weed is popping up through it. So seriously be careful though, because there's a lot of deer, and what I've seen is well-meaning people, they'll use like landscape fabric and they don't pin it down well enough, and a deer step on it and it shreds and it blows into their neighbor's property, or it blows into a water body. It's a bad look. So think hard. And then of course we have herbicide. And this is used clearly a glyphosate product, broad spectrum, kills every vascular plant. It's not a selective one that either hurts grasses or sedges or broadleaves or whatever. And this is, speaking of an eyesore, this is something you'll have to think about if you live in a residential area and you use an herbicide, and even if you use it perfectly safely, this could make some people nervous, and it's something you should think about in terms of the optics of what you do. So once we've cleared the site, by the way, I'm going to go through some counterintuitive things about these land clearing choices at the very end, show you some of our research and why this is a bit more complicated than we think. I'm going to give you a spoiler alert. I've become a de facto defender of herbicides. I'll show you why. Uh-oh. Okay, but before we get there, now that you don't like me, before we get there, some of the things, the minor things that turn out to be quite important that you can think about. If you've cleared the site using any technique and you have some exposed soil, typically what happens is the top layer hardens a bit in the sun. You just want to, if it's a small site and you've got students doing the work for you, you just want to give it a very light raking to create furrows to break that up. We don't want deep furrows, just a light raking to crack that hardened layer. If you have a large area, you can use a chain harrow and an ATV. This should probably be weighted because it's digging through turf, and what it creates is furrows. All we need is for seeds to be able to get into the mineral soil. What we would do is after seeding, I'm going to skip just real quick. If we were to broadcast seed, turn it out or throw it out, what we would then do is turn this thing over to the soft side so the tines are facing up, and then drag it again, and that'll knock the seeds, or at least some of them, into the soil. I mean, they're not going to fall up. So sowing seed, most of the sites we do, you can do by hand. I've done 10-acre meadows myself by hand. It's really not a big deal. You can then hustle arm wrestling because your one arm gets really strong. And then the seeds drop in. We see lots of them here. We also see those furrows we created. People make mistakes with planting meadows. They want to treat them like gardens or agricultural fields where they make nice fluffy soil. That will kill a meadow. These plants germinate better on a firm seed bed. The general rule of thumb is if you're an average adult and you step on the soil, your footprint should sink in no more than about 1/4 inch. That's good soil. We do make these light furrows though, because these seeds perform best either at the soil surface with a bit of soil on them so they become glued to it once they get wet, or no more than a 1/4 inch deep. I'd say 1/8 of an inch is the optimum germination depth in soil for the vast majority of the species we use in this process. We've tried it all different ways. That seems to work best. I don't think it's terribly important how deep they are, as long as it's no more than about a 1/4 inch. I've actually seen meadows not work at all because the drill seeder drilled too deep. And this is a drill seeder. This is a Truax brand. They're specially calibrated for this process. Your typical grain seeder that you would use for most agricultural practices wouldn't work for this because they're fed by gravity, and these fluffy seeds tend to get gummed up. And this machine has hoppers that push the seeds down and specially calibrated wheels to create furrows at the depth you choose. It puts the seed right in it and tosses a bit of soil on it. For most projects, less than like 10 acres in size, this is too expensive. It's going to cost more money just to put the machine on the guy's truck and tow it over than your whole seed project will. So usually we're thinking about broadcast. And if you broadcast, rolling it is critical. Press the seed into the soil. This is my hand roller. You bring it to a site, you fill it up with water, it gets to 250 pounds, and then you just do some exercise and roll it. If you don't have a roller, just walk on it a bunch. You can also make a 2x4 with a rope on it and step it down, kind of like how we used to make crop circles when I was a kid. You can do that. You can drive very slowly as long as the ground isn't too wet, because obviously the seeds will then stick to whatever gets wet. Very slowly drive a truck, an ATV over it. Have a dance party, have a dinner party. Seriously, because these seeds are used to being put where they want to be in the soil by the movement of large animals like bison, now cattle. So seriously, this can help a lot. And pressing the seeds in regardless is critically important. Otherwise, they take a long time to get to where they want to be in position. Many of them may rot or be eaten before then, and you're losing a lot of what your intended density is. Don't play these games like, oh, I'll just seed a little bit more and take a guess at how much I'm going to lose. You're just wasting money at that point. Mulch is sometimes useful. The problem with mulch is people go too deep. Mulch should only have enough mulch. If you're using straw, and that's what I typically go with, it should only be enough so all of the mulch is touching itself, but you should still see lots and lots of soil through it. And I typically use a tackifier after I put mulch down. Some of the mulches that we use, actually, you can even see it in the background. That's called Easy Straw. They have built-in tackifiers. It's a substance that gums up when it gets wet. We use like a guar gum organic-based one. Basically, what it does is it helps glue the straw to itself and the soil to give you another couple weeks of making sure those seeds stay in position and they germinate so they don't get washed or blown away. It's 100% worth it. I don't like doing this, but because it is the most time-consuming step. We almost always have to do it by hand because the machine applicators always put it too deep. But I have students and they do it for credit. So that's the only, it's the only reason it works. Labor is expensive. So if you have a site that's steep or you believe it's in a windy area, I do think consider the mulch. You don't want to lose everything just for skipping this step. If it's a steep site, you might need a mat of some sort. This I didn't put on, it's not put on correctly, it's too loose. It needs to be pinned incredibly tight to every divot in the soil, because what will happen, and what happened here is, if it's not pinned tight, the fastest germinating plants, in this case, it's a companion crop, it's just grain oats, they will grow first and they push the mat up instead of growing through it. And then all the other plants get stunted and crippled beneath it. There's a wonderful new product that we tried this year, and I absolutely love it. It's kind of like a paper mache. It's like bright green. They sell it at Site One Landscaping, and I'm going to order all of it now because now there's not going to be any next year. Uh-oh. And it basically just like glues itself to the soil once it gets wet. I should have put a picture in, but it works better than straw and jute and all of that. It's kind of pricey, but we had tremendous germination on basically dirt, mineral soil junk, and it was wonderful. So check out your supplies. Locally, Site One's great. They do sell some stuff at hardware stores like Home Depot, but man, Site One, those people know everything. So I was super happy with the stuff they had. This is a little wordy, but again, if this is being recorded, you can check later. Just some general timing for you all. Naturally, meadows or meadow plants tend to drop seeds towards the later part of summer into winter. Some of my grasses still have seeds hanging onto them. It might be more, quote, natural to seed a meadow that time of year, but Honestly, I get better results seeding meadows in spring. I feel like I have much more control over what's going on. So in this case, spring would be in our part of the world, anywhere from like late April to we did a meadow that's working out pretty well in mid-July. Central New York is quite forgiving in terms of hot, droughty, dry weather. If you're doing it in fall, I would say anytime after a hard frost, and that's usually October to November. And obviously, you don't want to seed right onto snow. Of course, that can work, but it gives you less predictability about what's going to happen to the distribution of those seeds. Best time to seed in fall is to throw seeds out right before it snows because you hide them from the birds. And hopefully that frost heaving when the snow thaws will help work them into the soil a little. I'll warn you though, if the site is wetter than average, so just on the moist side of average, frost heaving typically works against you. So if it's a drier site, it's a good thing. If it's a little too wet, I'd be cautious about doing fall seedings. Just an example. So again, looks like nothing. All we see is just some Avena sativa, the grain oats, some black-eyed Susans, and everyone's like, uh-oh. But then the next year, this is what you get. People tend to overmanage and they get nervous and they run in there and start pulling every species of plant that wasn't on the seed list I gave them. And I'm like, you're uprooting all the seedlings you can't see. Just relax, relax. Maintaining a meadow. So a lot less work than a lawn. I also do a lot of economic research, so I kind of use some economics terms. Think of a meadow as it's a higher capital investment because at the outset, you're paying to remove the vegetation, you're paying to buy the seed, you're paying for maybe some equipment you need to do it. But long term, the recurring management costs are much, much less than what you would pay to manage a lawn. At least if you're mowing it, every 10 days to 2 weeks or whatever, that can get quite expensive over the years. So when we talk about meadows are cheaper, this is what we're talking about, right? Another thing to think about too, we have to make sure this meadow stays a meadow. This is the Northeast. There are very, very few natural meadow type communities in this part of the world. And the ones that do exist because of the work of native people to maintain them. They needed to maintain space for the plants they needed to grow and the animals that are associated with those communities to be present. And this is another reason that I'm uncomfortable with calling any of this restoration. At a certain point, we simply decide what we think is most valuable and then just proceed. And there is no should, it's just is. So here are some things to think about as we manage our meadows. What is a weed? I put this Monarda punctata in my meadow, so I guess it's not a weed. It would be to a farmer, maybe. This is bone set. I didn't put it in my meadow. It came up on its own. Is that a weed? No. I didn't put it in the mix because I didn't want to spend the money. It was right on the edge of the woods. I'm like, it's probably in the seed bank. And it was. I didn't want to spend the money. I was like $400 a pound that year.
Wow.
How about this one? Common mullein. It's exotic, right? It's not native to North America. It's one of my favorite plants. I'm sorry, it is. Here's why. I see people yanking those out of meadows because it isn't on the list. Oh, God. It is the most important food for bumblebees in the mid-Atlantic in high summer when native plants tend not to be nectaring as much. And you look at pollen studies, and bees tend to get their pollen and nectar from the same source when they can. When you look at pollen studies, far and away, that's the most important plant in native bumblebees because it blooms at a different time as some of our natives. It's also a rigid stalk. It's the most robust stem in my meadow, and I have birds of prey perching on it. What is a weed? Come on. I don't know. Design considerations to keep your neighbors from thinking you just let your lawn go. A nice path is great. I'll tell you, people always want to lay out the paths first. Unless you have some topographic reason for doing that, I would let the meadow establish, then carve into it. It's way easier. Way easier. And if you keep mowing it, it's going to kind of turn into lawn look again. So just do the meadow first, then cut into it. Don't work around obstacles. These are examples. Again, I didn't do this. I could take a pretty thing and make it ugly somehow, but paths make space seem different. They can make areas look bigger and smaller. My partner is a landscape architect and artist, among other things. And this is magic to me. It's so cool. It looks like it could go on forever. Managing though, I'm a prescribed fire manager. There's not a single project I do anymore where this is appropriate, unfortunately. Fire isn't the most dangerous part. I know that sounds a little strange, but we can control the fire very easily with good lines and good visibility. It's smoke management. All the places where I live, they're high population density. They're near large and well-trafficked highways. I do not want to deal with that. You have to notify everyone. It's extremely dangerous. If you don't have the right vertical mixing height, that's where the smoke is taken up and then dispersed, it can drop back down. And this happens. People have been killed over this. The people who trained me to be a fire manager were associated with a fire where things went wrong and the smoke dropped on a highway. So fire is ideal because these plant communities are used to this and native people use this. And now all of a sudden we're like, oh yeah, hey, look at this new tool, fire. Grazing animals, these are cows that I staged in a meadow. It's a win-win. Many of the plants, especially the grasses that we use to restore these meadows, are the most nutritious in high summer, when our typical forages for cattle like fescues are the least nutritious. I'm a farm guy. Students of mine are shocked to learn that cows tend to lose weight in summer and you can make them gain weight in winter. It's tough to keep weight on a cow in summer, but if you incorporate these native grasses that are the most nutritious in terms of their nitrogen to carbon ratio, the cows love them. And the best thing is we use the cows to manage these plant communities because they preferentially eat certain plants over others. So in meadows where these taller grasses tend to get more aggressive and push out the flowers that we want to maintain for our invertebrate friends, we can stage cows in them, and over time they shift that back. By over time, I mean a grazing session a summer, and that's pretty much it. We typically have cutting as our replacement for these techniques. Cutting is largely to keep the woody species out. Meadow management in the Northeast is largely an exercise in resisting plant succession. It's very easy to do in small spaces. You don't need a bush hog like this. You could do it with a weed whacker. You could do it with hand pruners in many situations. The plants will continue coming back, obviously, unless you uproot them. Many of our problematic non-native shrubs, the plants that I truly call invasive, like common buckthorn and privets and things like that, plants that they're not just exotic, they have measurable harmful effects on the biota that we want to protect here. Those plants, you'll never kill them. If you cut them, you'll have to cut them until the end of time. So if you don't want to use herbicide to dab onto them, which is great, you don't have to do that. Just know you're in for an ongoing time commitment. If it's a small area, no problem. Have a stressful day, go and snip some nasty plants. Some basics. The first year, very important to cut your meadow. Cut it low. I know that you're really excited to see those black-eyed Susans bloom, but do not sacrifice the long-term success of your project just to see your very short-lived perennials or annuals like partridge pea bloom the first year. Those little plants, especially the grasses and other graminoids, like a lot of fox sedge in meadows, if they don't get good light the first year, they will not work. They're little needles the first year. They're doing all of their growing underground. So I strongly suggest just assume you're going to cut, okay? Especially if you use a companion crop, something like a grain oat, or we even use black-eyed Susans kind of like that. Work this into your planning and your budget. Long-term though, just to resist woody succession, I wouldn't cut any more than 3 or 4 years. People tend to overmanage these systems. They just get too into it, which is great, but you can get into your meadow treating it like a garden, not like a large-scale intensive management system. And I also, if you have enough space, break your meadow up into management units so you're not always cutting it all at once. That way you're never removing all of the habitat at once. That may not be practical, but if you can, try it. The best time to cut, to do the least damage to invertebrates and the other things that depend on meadows, is late winter. It is impossible to get a vehicle onto the ground without rutting up your lawn though. So maybe with a weed whacker, it's okay. If you can't cut then, late winter, like November, again, as long as the ground is hard enough, which is a big if, that's another good time because most of the insects that are seeking shelter at that time are already in shelter, and few rare things live in plant tissue like goldenrod gulls. It's the cool stuff that's on the ground, so you'll do the least harm. Cost savings? You probably can't read this, and I took this image from yes, the Xerxes Society's Mid-Atlantic Native Meadows Guide, which I love, but they took one of my meadow pictures, so hey. I don't really need you to look at the specific numbers, but look at some of the considerations. So the installed price per acre is a factor of things like, well, how much did we pay for all of the seeds? How much do we pay to manage it each year? What do we need to do? Meadows need no amendments. If you put fertilizer in a meadow, you will destroy it. The poorer the soil, the better your meadow will do in terms of maintaining plant diversity and supporting a diversity of insects. Never put fertilizer in your meadow. And to end, just talking about why do we do all of this stuff, just some examples of research that indicate the benefits of this work. We're obviously looking at plants. Specifically, we're looking at things like what shows up in terms of what was on the seed mix and what plants are volunteers. That's the polite word for a weed. I'm really interested in that because I think a lot of those weeds add a ton of value. There are things like dead nettle that bloom very early in the spring and provide food for pollinators that do not have other options in our bereft landscapes. So think broadly about your concerns about weeds. We're looking at this in terms of streamlining the process and saving people money to best advise on what might naturally fill in these gaps. We're obviously looking at pollinators. We have found a few cool species this year. So species that are uncommon in the state, they're both Melisodes bee species, subulatus and elatus. They don't have common names. We found both in the same sampling event in one small meadow, and they're associated with lanceleaf coreopsis, which isn't native to New York. This is why we break these rules on hypernativity. We're doing it for specific conservation reasons. And again, the unloved things. I hope that people care about soil biota. They're not as cute as bumblebees. Ugh. But these animals are responsible for generating many of the most important global services like nutrient exchange, carbon sequestration, soil building to enhance productivity to grow our food. And these animals are the reason why I'm kind of becoming a herbicide fan. You know why? Because I don't want people to think herbicide's good, but if you're thinking about what your goals are, do you really want to destroy this community just to help a different community like pollinators? When you till the soil, you disrupt its structure. When you use an herbicide, you're not necessarily doing that. And here's what we found. So we're looking at all of these communities in the meadows that we've created over the years. And far and away, the ones with the most species and the highest number of individuals per species and the cool rare stuff are the meadows where we used herbicide. Not because herbicide's good, but because we didn't disturb the soil using these soil techniques. In those areas, we have a higher density of things like thrips and other things we typically consider pests. We have relatively low diversity. I have never found a single pseudoscorpion in any meadow where we've disturbed the ground. I find them just over the line of that meadow in the lawn that's been undisturbed for a decade or more, but not in the area where we've disturbed the ground. So I really do not want to sound like a proponent of herbicides, but I need you all to think very carefully about what your goals are and how you select your tools. I'm not saying, oh yeah, go use herbicide, but maybe don't get as aggressive with your soil disturbance if you do not want to disrupt these very important communities just to benefit a different community. It's complicated. Anyway, final considerations before they yank me off with the shepherd's hook. I keep track of all the things people tend to worry about, and I think they're really important concerns, but let me tell you, mice, the small mammals that live in meadows are typically not the ones that want to go into your home. They might accidentally get in there like voles and shrews, but the mice, the Peromyscus mice, white-footed and deer mouse, and the invasive Mus musculus, I think it's house mouse, they want to be in your house. They live in malls. They don't need habitat. They're already in your house. I have never seen more mammals getting into structures. I've never heard a report of it for people that have meadows right up to the edge of their home. So can it happen? Maybe, but I've never heard it. I've been doing this for almost 16 years now. Snakes, garter snakes, maybe they're in there looking for frogs, but if you see a venomous snake in your backyard and you don't live in Cicero Swamp, please call me. Snakes need to sun themselves. It's not a big deal. You're not going to get a venomous snake in a meadow. They'd more likely be in your yard to sun themselves. And ticks, I'm fortunate to work with Dr. Brian Leggett. He has been working on this issue for years. I have been sampling ticks in meadows all over the East for nearly 15 years. And I never find more ticks in a meadow than I find in a lawn. You know why? They don't want to be out in the open anywhere. Meadows are too dry for deer ticks to persist. They're the ones that give you Lyme disease, so Ixodes scapularis. Dog ticks and the Lone Star tick, which is coming, it is coming. It's the one that when it bites you, it can make you allergic to red meat for the rest of your life. They can be in the open, but the Lyme vectoring tick, the deer tick, rarely in the open. If it's right on the edge of the woods, sure, because it's humid enough for them to persist. But we do not find more ticks in these meadows. It is likely because it is so diverse in there that there are so many other potential hosts passing by those ticks that the chances of you being the one thing to pass by are diminished. There might be other stuff that eats the ticks too. Maybe in systems where there's fire, it can suppress tick populations. We're actually looking at that right now on Long Island and some other places. It's probably a relatively time-dependent factor. Who knows? I think it's more there's just so much stuff in there. The ticks are spoiled for host choice. And so that's kind of it. I hope this was fun for you. Here's a bunch of stuff like how to get in touch with me. And like, if you want to read all of our work and learn about this stuff, please go there. That's one of those QR codes. I do not know how to use this stuff. My students do this for me. We're on social media, apparently. So if you do want to learn more or just write down my email address, you can email me. I know how to use that. I know how to use email and phone. There we go. So thanks so much for letting me come and talk to you. And then we find out the mic was unplugged for the Zoom audience the whole time.
Well, so we will go back and forth between having
Okay.
some questions from the audience here, and then we'll.
And what I'll do
find
is,
out whether anyone on Zoom has a question too,
and I'll make sure to repeat questions that are asked live just so they can hear. So,
Great.
So what about cardboard for smothering?
oh, cardboard for smothering. That's a great option. And do you want some? Because I got a basement. No, cardboard can be great. I've heard maybe there's some concerns if there's a particular dye used or whatever, but I've never seen anything terribly concerning. If you have the material, it's just about pinning it down. So you either got to throw a little weight on there, rocks, mulch, landscape staples. But yeah, great option. Yeah. Oh, do you want to alternate? I'm sorry. Okay.
Yeah.
I already ruined it.
Okay. We've been having a lot of flash floods, obviously, down these, I forget what they're called, these burst events,
Oh,
rain.
microbursts?
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, once I get the whole,
Yeah. So we've been having these microbursts, like flash flood situations in recent years. And I live in a floodplain, and I've been wondering about options for planting native plants that might help with areas where there's extra water that the town, and by the way, the biggest problem is between the street where it's paved and my lawn, and I would love to put in something.
is it kind of a ditch situation?
Yeah, water and flooding a little bit.
So we're working with, so the question is, these issues of flooding and how we can use some of these meadow plants and meadow establishment techniques to mitigate some of that. So we are working with the Skaneateles Lake Association specifically for plants designed for roadside ditches. So not only are they suited to these growing conditions, but they're highly salt tolerant. So we've got a fancy meter that we stick in the ground. It looks like the thing that Wile E. Coyote pushed in to blow up the dynamite to get the Roadrunner. And it's a really important question. So the reason that vegetation can be helpful for these water situations is vegetation can do two main things in this regard. It is robust and bushy, right? So it can slow the energy of overland flow. That's one thing. But really what we're talking about is these plants, in part because of their specific physiology and in part because we allow them to grow all big and bushy so they have a lot of surface area, they transpire water. So they pump it from the ground into the atmosphere orders of magnitude faster than grass does. Our mowed lawn grass. So they can simply move that water faster. Is that going to make a huge difference in a major flooding event for an area of that? Probably not noticeable, but is it helping? Absolutely. That's more of a comprehensive upstream issue. And if it's being channeled into a ditch, that's also an engineering issue. So yes, can plants do this? Absolutely. There are great wetland plants out there. I'm going to point you to those seed companies that I mentioned, Ernst Conservation Seed, Roundstone Seed, Prairie Moon, Pinelands, Prairie Nursery. They're all great. They even have pre-made seed mixes, many of which are designed for those conditions. And that is an excellent starting point. You can simply use that seed mix and maybe sub out a species or two that you would prefer in there. Or maybe there's one, it's like, that's never going to grow here. Use it as a starting point. And that might be a good way to go. Establishment, very difficult, especially if you don't own the site. But this is something we're trying to work with our transportation organizations to do to make sure that we can lower their management costs. That's what we're trying to do to get them to understand that this is value to them too. We don't want to create work. We're trying to maybe reduce some of the work they have to do. So that's a great question. I wish I could give you like a solid answer. Do you want
information about those seed mixes
I
or
mean-
dishes in your resources?
Yeah, if you go to the links, one off the top of my head from Ernst, it's number 105 on their website, the Music to Dry Riparian Pollinator Favorite Mix, I think it's called. It's like the codes for their vegetables at grocery stores. You just do it enough, you have them memorized. That's a good starting point one because it has a lot of rough, robust species in it, like some of the larger grasses, switchgrass, big bluestem, Indian, and a lot of the more robust and rhizomatous forbs, like some of the Joe pies, not Canada goldenrod, but some of the other goldenrods that can be very robust, but not as aggressive as Canada goldenrod. So I would start there. It's a great question.
It's
Yep.
okay. It's kind of on the same subject, like I do have a ditch and, on the road.
Mhm.
And, like a lot of my neighbors mow it and I don't.
Yep.
And I'm like, am I stopping water flow? And
It depends on the
supposed to
plant
take-
composition, because it depends on the plant composition. It's funny you mention this, and you may know specifically.
Repeat the question.
So the question is this your full question? I'll wait until you can ask the full one because I just interrupted you, and then I'll repeat it to her. Okay, so we're
It is, but most people mow theirs and I don't.
well, hopefully the ditches at least keep the invading army out, but it's like a moat. But so the question is kind of furthering this issue of ditches and roadside ditches, and now how do we manage them for best performance? And unfortunately, like the obnoxious scientist that I usually am, I'm going to answer this with it depends, because depending on the plants that are in there, it could be a mixture of plants that's specially designed to be in a roadside ditch, and you shouldn't mow it for best performance. It might be a different mixture of plants where not mowing it creates too much barrier and then culverts get gummed up. So I really can't say for sure without knowing it, but generally, if it's not like really, really deep, right? So your culvert has a lot of daylight and you can, I would let flowering stuff grow because you don't have to do the work. And then
Well, Yeah, it's about like, is it gonna back things up, but also like who is supposed to take care of those and like, can.
usually it's,
I give you the
it depends on
advice.
your township and those regulations. If you live with,
I talked to somebody and they're like, oh.
I hope it turns out it's not me.
It.
No, I don't know. It's going to depend on your municipality. Yeah. Yeah, I had to yell at them because they cut the staghorn sumacs I had on the edge of my property that blocked the view of the road. And they're like, oh, we thought we'd help you out by cutting these. I'm like, why? So I ran out in my underwear to yell at the guy. We have an online question.
People are asking about your opinion on using cardboard
Ooh.
and compost / soil method for small scale land clearing. And related. If we use the cardboard and compost soil method for land clearing, can we plant in the compost or will it be too rich? If not, can we just scrape the compost off?
So I would say if you can avoid adding any soil nutrients, do not add soil nutrients. The reason for that is if you have a relatively rich site, especially in terms of its nitrogen content, what happens is the most competitive plants at the early stages of the meadow's lives. So like let's see, what's a good one? Switchgrass, very competitive. Fast growing species or fast germinating species, the Alemus group, the wild rye, like Virginia and Canada. there are situations where if it's so rich, what happens is maybe 3% of the plants in that mix absolutely take over the first year. They do so well that they hurt the growth of all of the other species, and then only that species will grow. In poor soil, all of the plants are simply trying to hang on. And so it's kind of absurd to me that I see these projects where people had this old cattle pasture that's been destroyed by decades of mismanagement, and new owners have it. And they're like, oh, well, the first thing we have to do is pay $40,000 to add a bunch of fertilizer to it. Well, you just ruined it. So I would say if you can avoid putting things like even wood chips, but no compost if you can. Get cardboard's great, but anything that changes the nutrient content, and you got to be really careful with wood chips, because at depths of maybe 4 or 5 inches above that, you can get into issues of you no longer allow gas exchange with the soil biota. You can get into nitrogen locking situations where it can no longer be freed up for plants to use, and those effects take time to get back to equilibrium. Do the best you can to avoid putting any nutrients in there.
And just one related question to that is, please repeat what you said about what type of material to use for solarization.
Ah, great. Solarization, though in central New York where it's always cloudy, I just call it smothering because solarization is kind of, come on. Basically, we're talking about preventing plants from photosynthesizing. In fact, farther south where it's sunnier, you can truly solarize, and I've done it with clear plastic. And I'm no longer comfortable doing that because although it kills the plants, it also kills their seeds in the seed bank. And at first I was like, oh, this is great. And then I realized it killed almost everything in the top few inches of soil. It destroyed an entire biological community. So yeah, in the name of not using herbicide, I brought havoc upon a group of animals. So what you can think about is, did you want to?
I want to add to that. The question that I add to that is, have you measured how long it takes to come back from these different types?
Great question. So how long does it take, and I'll finish the initial question. So how long do these communities take to restore? Let's see, we're doing another year of sampling now. I still haven't seen any of the elements of biodiversity that are present in the meter adjacent to that site that we put the meadow in. None of them have come back yet.
How many years?
So far it's been 5 years.
Thank you.
So think about it. This stuff takes a while to move. So many of the organisms that live in the soil, they move by hitching a ride on a larger organism. They don't move much. And many of the most important microorganisms, like the fungi, the mycorrhizae that allow plants to function, plants don't work without these fungal associations. If you destroy that, your meadow isn't going to turn out so good. So again, let's not make rash decisions one way or the other. Can you remind me of the original question, please?
Yes, repeat what you said about what type of material.
Types of cover, yes. Materials that you can use for smothering. Permeable is best. Landscape fabrics work really well. They have to be pinned down and often used in combination with cardboard or something a little more robust so they don't immediately get like ripped up. If you can cover the site, even if you've got like, you know, what's the name of that stuff? Like the metal stuff that we put on roofs. Wow, my brain just blanked. Sheet metal or anything like that. Honestly, I wouldn't use metal if it's a really sunny spot, but anything you can do to prevent the plants from photosynthesizing. It's the more important thing you can think about is if you're using solid materials, so it doesn't have perforations in it, make sure there's like spaces on the edges where the water still drips in and there's still access to the atmosphere. So those animals underground can breathe. If you can use perforated fabrics, that's the best. I would not encourage you to do things like wood chips and mulch for the reasons I already discussed, but also because it is going to be hell to get it back off the ground. It's so much work. So yeah.
Black plastic, no?
Black plastic can be okay as long as it's not a continuous sheet that fully blocks. So if you have some holes in it, if you have layers where there's like, oh, okay, there's a space there, but there's not sunlight coming through because there's like an overlap. Yeah, I'm sure the people can see what I'm doing. Those are the things you should think about. Yeah. Oh, bunch of questions. Please.
For removal of a buckthorn or multiflora rosa, you're saying that herbicides are probably better than mechanical removal?
So it depends on your objectives. So, yeah, so thanks. The question is for removing some of our most problematic invasive shrubs like multiflora rose, buckthorn, and all of that of Central New York region. What is the best way to do it? And again, I'm going to say it depends. If there's just a few of them, I'd yank them up. If there's tons and tons of them and it was an area that I knew I couldn't manage all the time, like it was some far off place, I might in that case use targeted herbicide application. So it'd be a cut and a dab, not a spray. We don't want to aerolize it and aerosolize it in that context because it's going to kill everything else too. It's going to depend on your goals, what you're comfortable with, what the regulations are. Don't even mess with trying to get close to regulations. Just be as safe as possible. For example, if we use a glyphosate product, no matter where we're working, we only use, I'm quoting here, wetland safe glyphosate. The stuff that's pure glyphosate, typically the products and things like Roundup that are especially harmful to wildlife aren't the active ingredients. So the other things we put in there, the surfactants, like, some of the things are especially dangerous to aquatic organisms. Surfactants aid in the uptake of the chemical into the plant. So if you can get different formulations of herbicide that are approved for use in wetlands, I would use those all the time, just because I don't want to risk anything. So think about that. Never overuse herbicides. Lower concentrations almost always work better because they're more physiologically efficiently taken up by the plant. High concentrations often destroy the mechanisms that the plants use to transport nutrients around their bodies. So you're basically just burning it, you're top killing it, but you're therefore throwing a bunch of dangerous and unnecessary chemicals on the ground. If Dow Agrochemical says mix at 2%, you better believe mix at 2%. Don't go above that. So, yeah, herbicides. Yes.
Did you point to me?
Yes, please. Yeah.
At the scale of an urban lot, and where you don't necessarily have to worry about the cost of putting in plugs versus seed. Have you experimented with just letting grow what will grow there, just letting the lawn grow to see, at least for a year, what nature is going to give you for free?
So this is an excellent question. It's about reading the site and allowing what's going to volunteer on a cleared site, what plants to come up and see what happens. And this is great. This is what I do. And if I have the time, this is what I would always prefer to do. So as a lazy person, I don't want to pay for anything or do work if I don't have to. And what we can do is look at part of the property and get a really good idea of what might be in the seed bank. So if there's an unmanaged part of this property adjacent to it, that's one way you can get some sense. Another sense is, let's say you're thinking about doing a meadow in a year or two. You can make some very small, maybe a square foot disturbances in that site. Just, rough it up with a tool or something, remove the plants, scuff up the soil a little bit, doesn't have to be extreme. And then you're going to see stuff start to grow there. That's another way to see what might be in there. You can also just do a seed bank analysis. This is typically what I do. You take some soil samples, go about, I'd say 2.5 centimeters. Oh, right. We're in America. Go about an inch down. Just put an inch line on a coffee cup, stick it in there, take the soil, put it in a bag, maybe get like 15 of those, shake it up, put it in germination trays. And then you could do that any time of the year, as long as you can put it indoors. That's a window into the future. You're literally predicting the future of that plant community to see what's in there. So those are just a few techniques. Now, I love the idea of a managed succession, and that's what you're talking about. Rather than sterilizing the landscape and then adding back just the pieces we want, what you're doing is understanding enough about that ecology to just kind of tweak it when you need to. Maybe there's a plant that came up that you don't like. Just manage that plant, pull it, and let the other ones thrive, and maybe replace the empty spaces that you've just created with a few plugs that you just found at the garden center. I love that idea. And anytime it's practical, that is exactly what I would recommend. And by the way, the local biodiversity here is probably most benefited by those plants because that's what they're used to. So that's a great one. Thank you. Oh.
So here's something I didn't hear you talk about. Can you talk about watering weeds first year, second year, etc.? Watering.
Nope. That's the question.
There's no need to water.
Even, what was it? No, 2 years ago. during the Canadian wildfires where it looked like a hellscape and there was smoke everywhere. We also experienced a very droughty period. I should have put it in there. I got a great picture of one of those meadows, and the lawn is brown and crispy, and the meadow is bright green. I've never had to water a meadow in any circumstances. The only time I've considered doing it was farther south where it's much hotter and drier, and the seedlings germinated and we started experiencing a drought, and I was considering just throwing some water on then. I didn't do it. They were fine. The only time you might want to use water is if you have a hose and it's easy and it's a small enough area. When you plant the meadow, then just get it wet. You don't have to saturate it, get it wet. That immediately glues seeds to soil and helps hold them into position. And it might give you a couple more days of germination. That's really it. Yeah.
So if I live in the village of Liverpool and I don't mow my lawn, they're gonna come after me saying my lawn is
Oh,
not.
here we go.
So how, you know, I think the municipalities probably have to change their thinking. So are there tools or how do we get around that issue?
The HOA question. Much like ecological consulting, we used to think, the question. So we have a question on one of the most, if not the most important considerations for this work, and it's cultural. What if you live in an area where there's restrictions on how you manage your land, like vegetation height or vegetation height with distance from a building, etc.? There's reasons for those rules to exist that are legit, but there's also some misconceptions, some of which I mentioned. I'm not telling anyone to break the law, obviously don't do that. But you're right. It used to be that my example was ecological consultants were all considered crooks 20, 30 years ago. And now, like, okay, they're the good guys too. And I think we all used to just like, HOAs are just, they don't know what they're doing. And you know what? Now HOAs are coming to us because they actually want to do this because it saves them a ton of money. A new construction lot, it takes a lot to establish a nice turf lawn in conditions that a turf lawn doesn't want to be, but these plants are perfectly adapted to that. So that's one option. So I would suggest if you absolutely cannot through cultural means by talking to people and convincing them to let you try this, one thing is design features like a nice sharp border and a path. They really help to explain, no, this is gardening. This is not letting things go. This is gardening. Look how much work I put in there. Do you see that flamingo? Try those techniques. And if you absolutely can't, what I would suggest instead is that pollinators need woody plants the most in our region in early spring, and they benefit from open area plant communities like meadows more in late summer. If you can't do a meadow, consider a really, really rich and abundant planting of early blooming shrubs. That will greatly benefit the animals that are only active in early spring. Some of them are our rarest pollinators. So that could be an alternative.
And signs.
Yes,
Signs, yes. Make sure everyone knows it's intentional. And you know what? Maybe give them some herbs too. A lot of these plants are edible and be like, here, just be friends with people. That's the answer.
Done small suburban yard that we turned into mostly, but not entirely, areas which are native plants. We started small, piece by piece. There's still enough of our lawn in the front for us to sit out and enjoy the garden. There's sort of shape things. We've done it gradually, which I would say is the only way to do it. If you're doing it, don't try and do the whole yard at once. And we have a sign for two. And then people kind of get used to it. And they say, oh, there's flowers here, you know, and then it's not overwhelming.
It took me about 5 years, but now I am going flowers onto my neighbor's lawn. I'm taking out my neighbor's lawn, but it took quite a while.
I gotta say, and now that this is our 5th year, I did most of my work farther south before this, but now we have people telling us the neighbors that were initially nervous are now telling them how much they love seeing all the butterflies now.
Yeah.
So, and birds that are coming in. Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Here's a question. Can you talk about, I believe that they mean sequestration, carbon sequestration of planting herbaceous meadows as it compares to planting trees?
Yeah, so in terms of biomass, so that's literally just our material. This is my biomass. This is all of yours. Plants are made of carbon. So are we. It's one of the second or third most abundant element in our bodies. Oxygen's number 1. Carbon is stored in both the plants themselves and in the organic matter that accumulates in these plant communities and in the soil because of the actions of soil biota and the decay of plants, et cetera, that builds up this material in mineral soil. So things like organic matter content that represents largely carbon. So these plants, in terms of how they store carbon relative to forests, they're basically upside down forests. The vast majority of their biomass is stored underground. And again, I'm just being clear so you don't give me a gotcha question where the soil is deep enough to allow that. Obviously, if it's bedrock and 1.5 feet, that's as deep as you're going to go. So if you're talking specifically about carbon markets, which is another thing that I do, open areas are very quickly catching up to forests in terms of pricing them out for mitigation purposes. So that is coming on pretty soon. We understand fairly well that meadows and other open plant communities like grasslands represent an enormous store of carbon when managed correctly. So it's another value of these systems.
So you mentioned at one point, you were talking about the mix of plants that you could put in, and that you sort of avoided having a lot of bunch growing plants and a bunch of rhizomatous plants in the same area because the rhizomes would take over. Doesn't that make it difficult in a small yard to be next to grass, which is rhizomatous, and won't it invade if you have any areas with bunch?
Good point. So I would say that so plants compete with each other, right? And by the way, for those of you, the question is, which plants and their life history strategies, whether they're tall or short or rhizomatous, perennial, biennial, annual, et cetera, how do these factors play in? And I could do a 3-hour lecture on this, which I do for my students. So we got time. All right. I don't mind, but I'm pretty sure the state university system might ask you for credits, but a bunch of my lectures are online. So I download all the stuff that we have to pay for and I give it to my students. Yeah, I download all the stuff I have to pay for. I'm with you. So combining plants. This is a detail one. Would I combine something like Pycnanthemum tenuifolium, which is rhizomatous and it gets about this tall, with butterfly milkweed? Sure, because I know they work together. This is tricky. Now, that's an extreme rule of thumb. I wouldn't combine things on the extremes of the spectrum. I wouldn't do something like Cytotes grama, beautiful little grass, Bouteloua curtipendula. It's an S2 in the States, so there's only like 30 some populations left in New York naturally. Put in every meadow. It only gets this big, and then its seed heads stick up like this. I'm not putting that in a meadow that's full of Monarda fistulosa bee balm, because that Cytotes is going to be there for like 3 years. That's just a kind of experience thing with how plants behave in this part of the world. So I would see those guidelines on tall rhizomatous as don't do the extremes. I generally don't want Canada goldenrod in most of the meadows I do for people in residential areas because it just takes over. It's a great plant for a week and a half, and then it stops flowering and it pushes out all the other plants. So look at existing seed mixes that companies that do this professionally do, because they have had to test and test and test and streamline their work to make sure these plants behave well together and persist long-term together. And that is part of the research we're doing on how these plants interact, but that's an excellent starting point on how things interact at scale.
But does turfgrass not invade?
No, it's light. Things like allelopathy, you know, the chemical competition among plants, it's kind of like a shiny new toy distraction. Yes, plants compete chemically, but the competition that they have for light is 1,000 times more of the forcing function to how these interactions play out. So I wouldn't worry too much. Just don't plant a black walnut tree right above your meadow. That's gonna just. Though I do have a great list of plants that are resistant to black walnuts. If you do want a meadow under a black walnut tree, so do you want a meadow under a black walnut tree? Okay. Okay.
So my question was though, we all about clay or pretty much just clay soil, so any special considerations you would recommend for doing this with clay?
Yep, use clay adapted plants. Oh, okay. So the question is, and it's a good one that I get a lot. What if you have high clay soils?
I what?
High clay soils.
Yes.
In these situations, choose plants that are adapted to clay soils. this sounds like a joke, but I've been working with folks that they're super cool. I really like them, but they want to do a meadow. And they're like, we have really high clay content, and we got some quote from Cornell or something that we could amend the soil and basically make it like prime, beautiful, rich soil. It's going to cost like $13,000. We're just not sure. And I'm like, who'd you get that from? And they're like, well, an agronomist. So an agronomist's perspective is, let's make the site productive. They're not wrong, but that's not the goal of what we're trying to do. And I tried to tell them there are plants that grow on clay all over the world, including here. And those plants are available as seed. So some examples of plants that I've seen perform really well on clay are things like the lobelias can do well on clay. I have seen a lot of the pycnanthemums, the mountain mints, do pretty well on clay from wet to dry. Mudicum is my favorite, that's short tooth. That grows everywhere. It's also something, I forget its specific status, but it does have conservation status in New York. Fox sedge grows out of anything. I think I have fox sedge growing out of my pockets. Butterfly milkweed. Did you know that butterfly milkweed's natural habitat is like a gravelly slope, and people put it in these rich garden beds? And of course it looks twice as big because, yeah, you're weeding around it. If you had to have that plant compete with other plants, it'd be gone. Butterfly milkweed is a great one. Some of the asters, oof, what are some good ones? I think I've seen levagadus grow everywhere. There are great lists, and these companies have lists of plants that do pretty well on clay. So rather than spending a ton of time and energy changing the site, work with what you have where you are.
I have just a small area that I want to convert right for now. And it's right in my front yard, and it's just bound between the walkway to my house and my driveway and the sidewalk. So it's this little rectangle, but I don't want a meadow.
Yeah.
I just don't want grass anymore.
Oh, so this is a great question. If you don't want meadow, but you don't want lawn, and this could get at some of the concerns with restrictions on how we manage our properties too. You know what's better than a lawn? Pretty much anything. So there are many, many low growing species. So I don't know if it worked that well up here, but farther south, if you like Bermuda grass for whatever crazy reason, maybe you have a horse and that's why you like Bermuda grass. I don't. Maybe buffalo grass. It is a native that is almost exactly like Bermuda grass. And that's a great warm season lawn cover. It's nice and green when it's extremely hot and dry. What if you just do a carpeting of like side oats grama and maybe some of the sporoboluses, prairie dropseed, let's heterolepis, gracilis. You could try combinations like that. Oh, that doesn't work?
No, I don't know what they are.
I don't know.
Oh, sorry. Again, you gotta remember, on the test, the Latin name was worth twice as much as the common name. And I don't want to memorize a dozen common names. So. Side oats, one word. So side and then oats. Grama. No, I think there's just one. There are two M's?
There's still one.
I always mix up. So Eastern gamma grass and side oats grama, one of them has two M's, one of them has one. And I have not formed the neuron to remember that.
You garden up at ESF?
What's that?
Do you think people should visit the rain garden at ESF to see some of these things? Or not?
What rain garden?
Oh, it's not there anymore.
We had to update a building. There might be one, but the one I think you're thinking of is different now. They could come and see a meadow on our campus. I mean, that's, yeah. And the green roof, which is funnily enough, it's dominated by little blue stem, which is really neat because little blue stem can form like a turf carpet on very, very, very poor soil. So little blue stem is another great example of a plant you could use for a monoculture lawn that's still highly beneficial. And in those conditions, little blue stem's probably only going to get that big. In great conditions, it can get this big. But in very poor conditions, it forms a carpet, like on our green roof with 2 inches of soil.
Time. I started that and it's.
Yeah, it could be a fun one. You could have a nice lawn of lawn ivy or creeping Charlie. That stuff grows well around here.
I think. If you're using something like cardboard to solve it, The question is what to put on top of the cardboard to grow the seeds.
Oh, you don't want to grow the seeds on cardboard. I think the idea is that the cardboard over the span of a year that it takes for the site to sufficiently kill, that cardboard's either going to decompose, preferably, or you would remove it somehow. You do not plant onto it. You only want contact with good hard mineral soil, not like lots of organic matter.
In that regard, would jute, something like biodegradable like jute or geotextile work in to do those things?
It could, of course, depend, but jute mats work great. I love them because they tend to decompose at like the perfect rate as the plants germinate. Really like them. So again, there's a difference between using a material to smother the site to kill existing vegetation and the materials you would use for erosion management. And again, the erosion management is not to like necessarily cover the soil, but to hold the soil. So there's still a lot of apertures for the plants to poke through. Yeah, jute's one of my favorite materials. When you can use natural materials, they almost always work better for these processes, but they tend to be more expensive. Yes.
Okay, so I have an empty lot next to my house. I decided, no, I want it to be a meadow, so I didn't mow it for 2 years. First year, nothing happened, really just tall grass. Second year, a few things volunteered. So the end of last year, in the fall, I collected seeds all summer. I went around and I just pulled up clumps and sprinkled seeds all over. Do you think that's gonna work? Should I mow it this year? Do you think the grass is just gonna be too dry zones?
So the question is, can we do this kind of like adaptive or even opportunistic seeding? So the example is in an abandoned lot, if we want it to be a meadow, can we leave it and then pull up some bad things and then sprinkle some seeds where those things were pulled from and have created space? And can that work? And the answer is over time, if you keep doing that, it can kind of work depending on what your objective is for that site to look like. Is it energetically efficient? No. There's so much competition going on underground, even if the plant isn't directly above it, there's root competition from the plants around it. And typically these plants want, enough space so they can establish themselves, get their roots deep down and enough space to get light. And then they can be okay. But doing it like that, yeah, you might get a plant or two, but if you're thinking about, well, 1% of the seeds I just paid for worked, and there's kind of this randomness to it. If that's okay by you, then it completely works. But typically people want more of a predictable design to what they're trying to do. So it really just depends on your goals. Is it efficient? No. Can it be excellent for wildlife, especially invertebrates that like messier things? It can be great for them. In fact, that might have a higher richness of invertebrates than a perfect meadow with only like 24 species in it that over time accumulates some volunteers. Yes.
Can you talk about the black walnut?
The black walnut. So plants, many of which compete with each other, produce chemicals, quasinoids, these secondary chemicals. In this case, black walnut is renowned as the question was about going into detail on black walnut allelopathy and the other allelopathic competition among plants. So black walnut is one of the most extreme in terms of the strength of its allelopathic compounds. Yeah, so allelopathy is chemical competition among plants. They produce secondary compounds that aren't needed for growth, but are needed to compete with other plants. And typically what they do is they're most effective on new germinants. If a black walnut, its leaves start blowing onto the rooting zone of a mature oak, that nothing's really going to happen. But new germinants under highly allelopathic species like black walnut, what happens is it can decrease their germination. Either they don't fully germinate, seeds don't germinate sufficiently at all, or the plants just kind of die shortly after germinating. There are many plants that can grow under black walnut. There are many, many, many plants. And by the way, if it's under a tree, I wouldn't even call it a meadow anymore because the definition of a meadow is there's no trees. That might be something like an oak opening community that Native peoples manage for, which is an actual ecological community, not a meadow, which is whatever I say it is in the moment. So black walnut, though, I'm not really too concerned. Many of these plants, I have seen so many plants I use in meadows do great, including many that are shade tolerant that you might consider. The Alemus groups, or Virginia wild rye, Canada wild rye, they do really well under black walnut. Honestly, I think the issues that you will see under a black walnut are more to do with the shade it's casting on plants than the chemical competition. So I would look at, there's great lists online of, and in books, on which plants are tolerant to that. Many plants do this, some more severely than others. The tree of heaven, Ailanthus altissima, is considered moderately allelopathic. I've experimented with using its chips and its ground up leaves to see if it has a weed suppressing effect in rows of vegetable crops. So we can use it as mulch and it's maybe a weed suppressant. I didn't see any difference based on the controls, but you know, who knows? Nature's complicated. That's the takeaway from our talk. Nature's complicated. Yeah.
At one point you said, like, a new meadow, you would mow several times, 5 or 6 times, and then you said late winter to mow.
So the question is, how do you mow a meadow? So we're talking about two things. In the establishment year, the first year, let's say you seed it in spring. Throughout that summer, you might need to mow, 2 to 5 times. And that's to make sure that the fastest growing plants don't get so big, they block the light to the very slow growing plants. This is to make sure that everything you intended is going to sufficiently germinate and mature. The other thing is, in terms of its long-term management, really to suppress woody vegetation and to do things like break up some of the litter layers, so the dead plant material, we'd call it duff or, litter, whatever. Over time, after several years, that layer can get so thick that it's harder for new seeds to poke through it and then germinate to create new populations of plants. So the cutting can do that. So every 3 to 5 years cutting is when the meadow is already established.
You said for the new one, there's a better time of year to do it.
So in a newly established meadow, you're just cutting throughout the summer. Once the plants get up to your knee a little bit, cut them back down. Then for the long-term management, so you've got a meadow now and every year it looks relatively the same height because it's mature, every 5 years or so, you might cut the whole thing. But for most of you, you probably have relatively small lots. You can go out with hand clippers and just clip the woody stuff out. Yes. To do the least harm to especially the invertebrates and small mammals like songbirds that use meadows as winter shelter in big ice and snowstorms like we've been having, because those robust plants create pockets that they can use to not get buried in snow. The best timing for that is, if you can, late spring, because all of those animals can then leave. But usually that time is too wet to use vehicles like lawnmowers. So if it's small enough to use a weed whacker, maybe you can do that. Late winter is usually the safest time for people because it's too wet in spring. Late winter to cut a meadow if you want it cut over winter. We've had a frost. It's like October and November, really. Oh, I'm sorry, late winter. Late winter is the spring cut that we're talking about. I see why we're confused here. Gotcha. Late fall, how about that? Do you get all that?